He skipped his own mother's funeral to throw a birthday party for his wife. And tonight, in front of chandeliers, cameras, and the city's elite, my own son ripped the mic from the host and spat into my face. "Enough! You're nothing but a shadow clinging to my name." The room erupted in whispers. Before we dive into how it came to this, if you believe karma always finds its way, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The chandeliers above burned with an unforgiving brightness, scattering their glare across crystal glasses, silver forks, and faces painted with the smug confidence of wealth. The air carried the thick perfume of roses, champagne, and false praise. I had been here countless times before, in ballrooms where power dressed itself in tuxedos and diamonds, but tonight I was not a guest. I was a target. Derek's laugh cut through the air first, loud, rehearsed, meant for attention. Then, without warning, he stepped forward, tearing the microphone from the master of ceremonies. A hush fell instantly, like the room itself knew something vicious was coming. The host stumbled back, stunned, as Derek turned, his eyes locking on me with a fury I had never seen and never thought possible from my own son. "Enough!" His words cracked like a whip. Conversations collapsed mid-sentence. "Mother is gone, and you," he jabbed his finger at me, the gesture sharp and merciless. "You have no place in this family anymore. You're nothing but a shadow clinging to my name." The gasp was collective. Glasses froze halfway to painted lips. Forks hovered above untouched plates. In the corner, the string quartet faltered, their bows suspended, as if even the music recoiled from Derek's cruelty. The chandeliers did not blink. Their light bore down on me, trapping me under the gaze of every pair of eyes in the room. Whispers ignited, spreading like wildfire across tables. I could hear fragments. Did he just? His own father. God. The humiliation. Phones rose into the air. The first camera flash stung, then another, and another, each burst burning into my vision. My disgrace was being captured, multiplied, broadcast beyond these glittering walls. I felt the weight of it pressing into my chest, not just Derek's words, but the silence that followed. Silence from old friends who once shook my hand with respect. Silence from relatives who had eaten at my table, who had leaned on me in their times of need. Silence from men who owed me their fortunes. No one moved. No one spoke. Their stillness was worse than laughter. It was betrayal wearing the mask of indifference. I stood there, my hands clenched at my sides, my breath slow and deliberate. Not because I lacked words, but because none existed to meet this moment. A son denying his father in front of hundreds, erasing decades of sacrifice with a single sentence. The shame was public, brutal, final. And as Derek handed the microphone back, satisfied with the wound he had carved, I knew one thing for certain. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something colder, sharper, inevitable. In that glittering sea of gowns and tuxedos, not one voice rose in my defense. And yet, deep inside the silence, something else stirred, not despair, but resolve. Long before chandeliers and crystal, there were years of calloused hands and sleepless nights. I remember when money was a rumor and security a dream. I clawed my way through the dust of construction sites, through deals that threatened to drown me, through rivals who smiled in the day and sharpened knives at night. Every victory I earned was stitched with sacrifice, my blood, my youth, my marriage, stretched thin by endless work. But I told myself it was worth it. I told myself all of it was for him, Derek, my only son. I built an empire of steel and glass, towers that cut into the Dallas skyline. People called me ruthless, but I was only relentless. I had to be. And through every late-night meeting, every compromise that gnawed at my conscience, I whispered the same promise to myself. My boy will never know hunger, never know fear, never know the clawing desperation that shaped me. When the company began to flourish, I laid out a future for Derek as if it were a banquet. Private schools, the kind that mold governors and CEOs. Tutors flown in from across the country, vacations in places I had once only seen in magazines. I placed the world at his feet, convinced that the more I gave, the more he would understand the weight of love behind each gift. I thought I was building more than a fortune. I thought I was building loyalty, gratitude, maybe even respect. Instead, I was laying bricks for my own gallows. I can still see the look on his face as a boy, running across the lawn of our first house, our house, the one I swore would be his someday. His laughter was pure, untainted. If I close my eyes, I hear it still, mocking me now, because I believed that innocence could last forever. What I didn't know then was that every sacrifice I made, every dollar, every dream deferred was planting seeds not of gratitude, but of entitlement. And the man who stood before me at that birthday party, dripping with arrogance, was not my son anymore. He was the sum of everything I had given and everything I had lost. It began with small things so small I convinced myself they didn't matter. When Derek graduated from that private academy, I had written the check for every semester without hesitation. Tuition that could have bought another house, another plot of land to develop, another investment to secure my retirement. But I told myself, this is the cost of love. Then came the house in Dallas, a beautiful home in the suburbs, with oak trees lining the street and a lawn wide enough for children to play on someday. I signed the deed and pressed the keys into Derek's palm. His face lit up, but not with surprise, only with the certainty that this was his right. I waited for the words, "Thank you, Dad." They never came. I brought him into the company, too, his first position, a management role, not because he had earned it, but because I wanted him close, wanted him to learn the ropes, to stand beside me. I thought we would build the future together, father and son, side by side. Instead, he arrived late to meetings, skimmed reports, treated seasoned employees with the arrogance of a boy who believed leadership was an inheritance, not a responsibility. Every time I looked at him, I swallowed my disappointment. I told myself he was young, that maturity would come. I defended him when my partners raised questions. I scolded them for doubting him, even as a small voice inside me whispered the same doubts. The first betrayal wasn't the words he hurled at me years later, it was the silence when I gave and gave and gave and received nothing back. No gratitude, no respect, only expectation, as if my sacrifices were not love, but obligation. That was when I first understood. I was no longer a father in his eyes. I was a vault to be emptied, a ladder to be climbed. And each time I let it go, each time I forgave the ingratitude, I was paving the road to the day he would one day look at me and say, "You are nothing but a shadow." The church smelled of lilies and rain-soaked stone. My wife's coffin rested at the front, draped in white roses, the air heavy with hymns and grief. I sat in the first pew, hands clenched so tight my knuckles turned white, waiting for the sight of my son, waiting for the moment he would walk through those doors and stand beside me in mourning. But the doors never opened. Each minute passed like a knife twisting deeper. I kept glancing back, convincing myself he was running late, that traffic had delayed him, that surely nothing could keep a son from his mother's farewell. But the truth arrived with every tick of the clock. Derek wasn't coming. He wasn't at the burial either. As the casket was lowered into the earth, the sky opened with a steady drizzle, as though the heavens themselves mourned. Still, his absence was louder than the thunder rolling in the distance. People whispered, exchanging looks they thought I didn't see. Some pitied me, others judged. I felt both. Later, I learned where he had been. Photos surfaced online, tagged and smiling, champagne in hand. Derek hadn't been trapped by traffic or business. He had been hosting a birthday party for his wife. Balloons, sparklers, and laughter filled the same hours that I stood by a grave, saying goodbye to the woman who had given us everything. I will never forget the hollow in my chest when I saw those photos. Her funeral was the moment to bind us in grief, father and son. But instead, it revealed the truth. I had lost them both. My wife to death, and my son to his own selfishness. The lilies at the altar wilted within days, but the memory of that empty seat beside me has never faded. The night of Derek's birthday glittered with extravagance. Crystal chandeliers swayed above tables dressed in silk, champagne fountains spilled like rivers of gold, and a string quartet filled the air with polished elegance. Guests wore gowns and tuxedos, their laughter rising like smoke in the grand hall. From the outside, it looked like a celebration of success, of youth, of a man who had everything. But beneath the glamour, I sat quietly, a ghost at my own son's table. No one spoke to me unless politeness demanded it. Smiles slid past me, their eyes always drifting back to Derek, who soaked up admiration like a sponge. I told myself I was there to support him, to honor him. After all, what is a father if not a witness to his child's triumphs? Then Derek stood, glass in hand, and the room obeyed his silence. He thanked his wife, his in-laws, his friends. He spoke of his rise, his achievements, his vision for the future. But when his gaze landed on me, the warmth in his voice evaporated. He walked to the host, ripped the microphone from his hands, and with a voice sharpened by pride, he declared, Enough. Mother is gone. And you, his finger stabbed the air toward me, you have no place in this family anymore. You're nothing but a shadow clinging to my name. The words echoed louder than the applause that had filled the room moments earlier. Gasps rippled. Cameras flashed. I felt 100 eyes pierce my skin. No one stood up for me, not family, not friends, not colleagues who once depended on my handshake. They sipped their wine and whispered as though my humiliation was entertainment. I sat still, every muscle taut, my dignity stripped bare under the chandelier's cruel light. That was the moment I understood the depth of Derek's betrayal. The son I had given everything to had chosen not only to reject me but to erase me before the world. And as the applause awkwardly returned, as though nothing had happened, I knew the night was not about his birthday. It was about my funeral, the burial of my honor in front of the elite who once respected my name. It sat in my garage for decades, polished to a shine that gleamed like liquid midnight under the sun. A 1962nd Cadillac. More than a car, it was a memory, a symbol of the years when I first believed dreams could be built with bare hands and stubborn will. I had bought it after closing my first big real estate deal, a promise to myself that the boy from nothing had finally carved a piece of the American dream. I told myself I would never sell it. That Cadillac carried the weight of my youth, Sunday drives with my wife, her scarf fluttering in the wind, Derek in the back seat, small hands reaching out of the window to catch the rushing air. It wasn't just steel and chrome, it was my life, wrapped in leather and gasoline. But when Derek came to me, eyes wide with desperation, begging for a loan to start his own business, I looked at that car differently. He spoke of ambition, of making his own mark, of proving himself. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to give him the chance no one had ever given me. So I did what fathers do. I sacrificed. I sold the Cadillac, my last relic of pride, and handed Derek the money. He barely looked at me as he pocketed the check. No hug, no thank you, no acknowledgement of what it cost me. To him, it was just money. To me, it was decades of memories, gone in a single transaction. I told myself it was fine, that one day, when his business thrived, he would look back and understand the depth of what I had given. But the truth settled heavy in my chest even then. A father's sacrifices are invisible until they are forgotten. And Derek forgot quickly. We had planned it for years, a trip to Italy to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary. My wife kept travel brochures tucked between cookbooks, smiling as she pointed to pictures of Venice gondolas and the rolling hills of Tuscany. She deserved that trip more than anyone. After decades of raising our son while I chased deals and money, she dreamed of walking cobblestone streets hand in hand, finally living for herself. The tickets were nearly booked. I had marked the dates in my calendar, a rare pause, carved out of a life consumed by responsibility. For once, it was not about business, not about Derek. It was about her and me, about us. Then Derek came with another request. A new house. A bigger one, better one, in a neighborhood where ambition sparkled in the driveways. He spoke of needing the down payment urgently, of how this house would secure his future. He spoke with such conviction, such entitlement, as if it were already his. I looked at the brochures, at the pictures of Italy still sitting on the kitchen counter, then at my son's eager face. My wife stood quietly, her lips pressed together, knowing what I would do before I even said it. I canceled the trip. I wrote the check. I told myself we could go next year, that there would always be another time. But time is not a bank account you can keep refilling. My wife never saw Italy. She never rode in a gondola, never sipped wine in Tuscany. A piece of her dream was buried the day I traded it for Derek's house. And though she never once blamed me, I saw the disappointment in her eyes every time she turned a page in those brochures. She folded them away eventually, but I never forgot. That house stood tall for Derek, and for me it stood as a monument to a promise broken, a memory that would never be made. The house I lived in after all the years of building, striving, clawing my way through business, it wasn't just wood and stone. It was the last fortress of my dignity. The walls echoed with my wife's laughter. The floors carried the memory of Derek's small feet running across them. It was the last place that still felt like home. Then Derek came again, not with ambition in his eyes this time, but with panic. He was drowning in debt. His business had faltered, his pride outpaced his skill, and creditors circled like vultures. He spoke of bankruptcy, of ruin, of shame. He said if he fell, everything he had built, including the family name, would collapse with him. I wanted to tell him failure can be a teacher, that sometimes a man must crawl through his mistakes. But when I looked into his eyes, I didn't see a man ready to learn. I saw the boy I had once carried on my shoulders, the boy who believed I could fix anything. So I did what fathers do. I signed the papers. I mortgaged my house, my last anchor, and poured the money into Derek's hands. My home became a liability, a burden tied to someone else's recklessness. I packed my memories into boxes and moved into a small rented apartment, stripped of the comfort I had earned in my old age. The day I handed Derek that money, he embraced me for the first time in years. His arms were tight, his voice shaky with relief. For a fleeting moment, I believed maybe this time he understood the weight of what I had given. Maybe gratitude had finally found its way into his heart. But gratitude fades fast in a man who thinks sacrifice is his right. Within weeks, his tone shifted back to arrogance. His voice sharpened with entitlement. And I, sitting in a rented room, staring at walls that held no memories, realized the truth. I had not saved him. I had only delayed the fall and destroyed my last refuge in the process. The apartment was small, with walls that echoed not with laughter, but with emptiness. No photographs adorned the shelves. No warmth lingered in the corners. I told myself it was temporary, that once Derek was steady, I would return to a place that felt like home. But as weeks bled into months, the silence grew heavier. Evenings were the worst. I would set a single plate at the table, the scrape of fork against porcelain reminding me that I was eating alone. My wife's chair sat empty, its absence louder than any voice. Sometimes I placed my hand on the backrest, as though I could summon her presence with a touch. But the wood was cold. Derek rarely called. And when he did, it wasn't to ask how I was, or if I needed anything. His voice always carried the same edge requests, disguised as conversations. He needed introductions to investors. He needed money, shifted from one account to another. He needed me, but not as a father, as a resource. I tried to convince myself that this was the way of life, that children grow busy, that I should be proud to see him thriving. But pride does not grow in silence. Silence only feeds doubt, and doubt gnawed at me each night as I stared at the ceiling, asking questions no one would answer. The only sound that kept me company was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional drip of a leaking faucet. I lived surrounded by noise, yet never more alone. There were moments brief, fleeting, when I thought of picking up the phone and calling him just to say, "I miss you, son." But the memory of his tone, sharp with impatience, always stopped me. I knew how the call would end, with me listening to the hollow sound of my own disappointment. So I stayed silent, and in that silence I began to realize I had given Derek everything except the one thing he truly needed to learn: how to love without taking. It was Derek's idea to bring me along. "You should get out more," he said, flashing that smile that always looked better in photographs than in real life. He wanted to parade me at his golf club, the one with manicured greens and members who measured worth by the cut of a suit and the brand of a watch. I agreed, not because I wanted to go, but because a father takes what scraps of time his son offers. The club reeked of arrogance. Men in pressed polos laughed too loudly. Women in wide-brimmed hats glanced at me with the polite disinterest reserved for relics. Derek introduced me with the flourish of a showman, calling me the old man who used to run the family business. His friends chuckled, some with genuine amusement, others with the sharp edge of mockery. One of them leaned closer, glass of whiskey in hand, and said, "So, you're the legend, huh? Funny, you don't look like much of a powerhouse now." The table erupted with laughter. Derek didn't defend me. He laughed too, laughed harder than all of them, as if their cruelty was a joke worth sharing. I sat there, forcing a smile that tasted like ash. My palms burned against the linen tablecloth. My chest tightened with shame. Not for myself I had survived wars and business. I had faced worse insults. No, the shame came from watching my own son choose approval from strangers over respect for his father. The meal stretched on, filled with jabs and subtle digs, each one met with Derek's easy laughter. I chewed each bite like it was glass, swallowing pain with every sip of water. By the end, I excused myself, claiming fatigue. In truth, I could no longer stand the sound of their laughter or his. As I walked out into the parking lot, the night air cold against my face, I realized something. It wasn't the stranger's mockery that cut me deepest. It was Derek's silence, his refusal to stand by me, his choice to let me be their punchline. That was the night I understood. Humiliation wasn't an accident anymore. It was a pattern, a choice he made again and again, at my expense. The day we laid my wife to rest, the church was filled with lilies and hushed sorrow. Friends and relatives gathered, their voices low, their eyes red. I sat in the front pew, the weight of grief pressing me down, my gaze fixed on the coffin draped in white roses. Beside me sat an empty chair reserved for our son. I kept looking toward the door, convinced it would open any moment. Surely, no matter the distance, no matter the excuses, he would come. This was his mother, the woman who carried him, who stayed awake at night nursing his fevers, who cheered at his every small victory. Surely, he wouldn't abandon her final farewell. But the door stayed shut. Minutes passed. Hymns rose and fell. The casket was lowered, and still, that chair remained empty. The whispers started then, quiet and sharp. Where is he? How could he not be here? Their pity was salt in an already bleeding wound. Later, I found out where he had been. Photos plastered across social media, Derek grinning in a tailored suit, his arm around his wife, champagne glasses raised high. Balloons, sparklers, and laughter filled the images. While I stood at the graveside in the rain, saying goodbye to my wife, he was hosting a birthday party for her. The betrayal didn't just sting, it hollowed me out. A son absent from his mother's funeral is more than careless. It is cruel. It is a severing of blood and bond. I will never forget that empty chair, sitting beside me like a ghost. The silence of his absence screamed louder than the choir, louder than the priest's prayers, louder than the dirt thudding against her coffin. That day, I buried more than my wife. I buried the last fragile hope that Derek still carried a son's love in his heart. By the time Derek stood before me at his birthday party, spitting venom into the microphone, I had already carried years of wounds he never cared to see. I endured the sale of my Cadillac, the sacrifice of our anniversary, the loss of my home, the loneliness of widowhood, the mockery at his club, and the crushing silence of his absence at his mother's funeral. Each memory weighed on me like a stone, stacked higher and higher until I could barely breathe beneath them. And then, under the chandeliers, he struck the final blow. His words weren't just cruel, they were a death sentence. You're nothing but a shadow clinging to my name. In that moment, the man I once called my son was gone. What stood before me was a stranger wearing his face, a man molded by arrogance, greed, and contempt. The room erupted in whispers, laughter, and flashes of light. No one defended me, not family, not friends, not colleagues. Their silence echoed the truth. I was utterly alone. But in that silence, something shifted inside me. It was not despair, it was resolve. For too long I had convinced myself that love was sacrifice, that giving was proof of devotion, that silence was dignity. I told myself that patience would one day buy me his respect, his gratitude, his love. But patience had bought me nothing but humiliation. As Derek basked in his moment of triumph, drunk on his own cruelty, I realized I had reached the end. Not the end of my strength, but the end of my tolerance. There are betrayals you can forgive, and there are betrayals that carve so deep they become irreversible. This was the latter. And as the applause returned awkwardly to the room, I understood that what Derek believed was my burial was only the beginning of something else. I would no longer suffer in silence. I would answer him not with fists, not with rage, but with something sharper, something final. Justice. In the days after the party, I returned to my apartment and pulled out boxes that hadn't been opened in years. They were heavy with dust, filled with contracts, ledgers, and memories of battles fought in boardrooms instead of ballrooms. My hands trembled not from age, but from the weight of what I was about to face. I sifted through stacks of paper until one folder caught my eye. Yellowed at the edges, its clasp nearly rusted shut. It held documents most people had long forgotten. But I hadn't, not truly. They were the proof of my labor, my foresight, my control. There it was, clear as the day I had signed it. The certificate declaring my ownership. Majority shares, voting rights, veto power. The ink may have faded, but the authority was eternal. Derek may have strutted around as though he owned the empire, but legally, his throne was built on sand. I sat back in my chair, the papers trembling in my grip, and for the first time in years, I felt something other than grief or humiliation. I felt power. I had given Derek everything, but not this, not the final card hidden in the deck. He thought I was nothing more than a relic, a shadow. But shadows have a way of lingering, of reminding the living where the light truly comes from. As I stared at those papers, a slow, deliberate calm settled over me. This wasn't revenge, it was truth. Truth he had forgotten, truth I had preserved, and now truth would become my weapon. The Empire still bore my name, whether he admitted it or not, and soon the world would remember. The next morning, I dressed in the same gray suit I had worn to countless negotiations, though the fabric now hung looser on my frame. I carried the folder beneath my arm like a weapon concealed in plain sight. The world thought I was finished, but the world hadn't read these documents. I walked into a modest law office tucked between a coffee shop and a bookstore. No grand marble lobby, no brass nameplates, just a discreet brass bell above the door that chimed softly as I entered. This was intentional. Power moves best when cloaked in silence. Behind a desk sat Richard Hale, an old friend and attorney who had weathered decades of corporate storms by my side. His hair was white now, his back bent, but his eyes remained sharp predator's eyes, hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses. He rose slowly, shaking my hand with the firmness of a man who still believed in the weight of promises. "Edward," he said quietly, gesturing me to sit, "I wondered when you'd come back. The creches, he's note." I laid the documents across his desk. He adjusted his glasses, reading carefully, his lips tightening as he realized what they meant. "You still hold majority shares, veto rights. Derek has no idea, does he?" I shook my head. "He thinks I'm powerless. That's how I want it." Hale leaned back, folding his hands. "Then you have two choices. Bury this in the drawer again, or use it. But if you use it, Edward, there's no turning back. Once the board sees these papers, Derek's empire is no longer his." I stared at the folder, at the ink that had once seemed nothing more than formalities. Now they were shackles for Derek, forged long before he thought to betray me. "I'm not here for revenge," I said finally. "I'm here for justice." Hale nodded, his expression grim. "Then justice you shall have. But remember, justice makes no room for forgiveness." It wasn't difficult to find the evidence. I only needed to follow the trail Derek had carelessly left behind. Arrogance has a way of documenting itself, and my son's vanity was a paper trail written in his own hand. I began with the footage from his birthday party, already circulating in hushed whispers among guests, who couldn't resist sharing their recordings. Dozens of angles, dozens of phones capturing the moment he stripped me of my dignity under crystal chandeliers. Every word, every sneer, immortalized on camera. That alone was enough to shake his empire. But I didn't stop there. I combed through old emails, board meeting notes, and recordings from company events. Hale helped me subpoena documents Derek thought buried financial statements that revealed recklessness, messages laced with contempt for investors, careless comments that treated loyal employees like pawns on a board. There were photos, too, posted online by his wife and her circle of friends. Lavish vacations paid with company funds, parties dripping in excess, each one time-stamped and catalogued for the world to see. Every image told the same story. Derek believed he was untouchable. Each discovery was a nail in the coffin he had built for himself. Piece by piece, I assembled a mosaic of his arrogance. Not a smear campaign, no lies, no fabrications, only truth. Truth so sharp it cut without effort. One evening, as I spread the evidence across my dining table, I paused and studied the faces in the photos. Derek, grinning wide, champagne raised high, surrounded by people who laughed at jokes he didn't deserve to tell. I wondered if he remembered the nights I stayed in the office until dawn, the deals I nearly lost, the friendships I sacrificed just so he could stand in those rooms. Looking at those photographs, I realized something bitterly clear. Derek had not only forgotten my sacrifices, he had erased them. And now, it was time to remind him, in the only language arrogance understands, exposure. I returned to my routines, moving through the days as though nothing had changed. At least, that's what the world saw. To Derek, I was the same weary old man, diminished and powerless, still clinging to scraps of relevance. He mistook my silence for surrender. But silence is not weakness. Silence is a mask. I attended a few family dinners, sitting quietly at the edge of conversations, nodding politely as Derek held court with his stories and boasts. I let him revel in his delusion, let him believe I was invisible. Each time he dismissed me with a smirk or a glance at his wife, I hid my resolve behind a tired smile. At business gatherings, I walked through the halls like a ghost. Executives who once sought my approval barely acknowledged me now. Derek relished it, introducing me as if I were a relic, my father, the man who used to run things. His words carried just enough venom to remind everyone where he believed I stood, buried in the past. I said nothing. Not yet. At night, In the quiet of my apartment, I reviewed the documents again, spreading them across the table until the surface was buried beneath proof of my authority. Contracts, certificates, photographs, emails. Every piece of evidence sharpened the blade I would one day drive into his empire. Hale would call occasionally, his voice steady and low. "We're ready when you are," he'd say. I always answered the same way. "Not yet." Because timing is everything. Strike too early, and he would recover. Strike too late, and the damage might consume me too. No, I had to wait for the moment when arrogance blinded him completely, when his empire stood so high on stilts of pride that its fall would echo for miles. So I let him laugh. I let him boast. I let him believe I was powerless. All the while, I sat in silence, patient, watchful, sharpening the knife of truth. The storm was coming, and Derek never saw the clouds gathering. Word travels in silence, faster than in shouts. Old allies, men who had once stood with me in boardrooms, who had shaken my hand when their fortunes were fragile, began to reach out. Not publicly, not yet, but quietly. A phone call here, a letter there, the occasional visit under the guise of nostalgia. They remembered. One by one, they reminded me of what I had done for them. The deals I brokered that saved their companies. The loans I extended when banks turned their backs. The introductions I made that lifted them from obscurity to prominence. My name was not just history to them, it was a debt still carried in their ledgers of memory. Over cups of coffee and hushed meetings in dim restaurants, they spoke carefully. "Edward, you built this city's skyline," one of them said, his voice weighted with respect. "We haven't forgotten who laid the foundation we stand on." Another leaned closer, his tone sharper. "Derek doesn't understand loyalty, but we do. He's marrow." I listened, nodding, my heart a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. These men had prospered because I once believed in them, and now they were offering to believe in me again. Not out of pity, but out of respect. Hale, ever cautious, warned me to move slowly. "Allies can turn with the wind," he said, "but loyalty built on gratitude has roots." And he was right. These weren't opportunists sniffing for gain. They were men who knew the value of what I had given and who were ready to turn their backs on Derek the moment the truth surfaced. It was in those quiet encounters that I felt the tide shifting. Derek had power, yes, but power without loyalty is brittle, and I, the man he thought broken, still carried loyalty like an ember that could burn an empire down once the moment was right. It was a single sheet of paper, but it carried the weight of a gavel. Hale drafted it carefully, every word chosen like a scalpel cutting into flesh. At the top, in bold print, it read, "Notice of Emergency Board Meeting." My name, still listed as majority shareholder, gave it the authority to summon every executive, every director, every man and woman who thought Derek's rule was unshakable. I read the letter 3 times before I signed it. My hand did not tremble. Not this time. When the pen left the page, I felt a shift, as though years of silence had been broken by the simple curve of my signature. Hale slid the document into an envelope, sealing it with deliberate care. "Once this is delivered," he said, "there's no going back. The board will have to listen. And Derek, he won't see it coming." I nodded. "Good. I don't want him to." For years, Derek had paraded himself as the rightful heir, the king of an empire built on my blood and sweat. He believed the foundation was his, but the truth was hidden in ink and paper, preserved in the contracts he never bothered to read. The delivery was swift. Couriers hand-carried the letters across the city, each one arriving at polished offices, where power lounged in leather chairs. I imagined the expressions of the board members as they read my name, as they realized the old man they dismissed as irrelevant had just called them to account. That night, I sat alone at my dining table, the city lights flickering through the blinds, and I allowed myself a small, cold smile. The silence that had weighed on me for so long was breaking. The machine was in motion now. The meeting was set, a date carved into stone, and with it the promise that Derek's empire was no longer untouchable. Among the files and contracts, one piece of evidence gleamed sharper than all the rest: the video. Dozens of phones had captured it, but I held the cleanest version, uncut and undeniable. Derek under chandeliers spitting venom into a microphone. "You're nothing but a shadow clinging to my name." The cruelty in his voice, the smug laughter in his eyes, it was all there, preserved forever. I watched it more times than I should have, not because I enjoyed the pain of reliving it, but because I understood its power. In business, perception is everything. A man can weather financial losses, but he cannot survive the collapse of respect. And this video was not numbers on a ledger, it was character exposed in its ugliest form. Hale agreed. "This is the nail in the coffin," he said, his tone flat, almost clinical. "Once this is circulated, Derek will be untouchable, not in power, but in disgrace. No investor will trust him. No partner will follow him. His empire will rot from the inside." I nodded, staring at the frozen image on my laptop screen. Derek's face twisted in arrogance, finger pointed at me as if striking down a criminal. I thought of the whispers that had filled the ballroom that night, the way old friends and allies had turned their eyes away, choosing silence over loyalty. Now that silence would work against Derek, because I would not keep this clip locked in a drawer. It would go to family, to investors, to the golf club where Derek strutted like a king. It would seep into every corner of the life he had built, poisoning the very foundation of his reputation. I closed the laptop, my decision made. The documents gave me power in the boardroom, but this video was the weapon that would destroy him in the court of public opinion. The time for silence was over. The time for justice had arrived. The first step was concealment. Power moves best when unseen, and I had no intention of letting Derek sense the blade before it cut. Hale advised me to transfer my majority shares into a legal trust under his control, anonymously, quietly, beyond Derek's reach. On paper, it looked like nothing more than estate planning. In reality, it was the tightening of a noose. We met in Hale's office again, the blinds drawn, the city muted beyond the glass. He placed the documents before me, each line of text a hidden dagger. "Once you sign this," he said, "the shares won't trace back to you directly. Derek will believe he still owns the empire outright, but every vote, every veto, every ounce of authority flows through us." My pen hovered for only a moment, then I signed. The sound of ink against paper was louder in my ears than any of Derek's insults. It was the sound of control slipping from his hands into mine. When the paperwork was complete, Hale leaned back, studying me. "He'll never see it coming," he murmured. "As far as Derek knows, you're still the powerless old man he mocked in front of the world." And that was exactly what I wanted. Let him bask in his arrogance a little longer. Let him strut across golf courses and gala halls, blind to the storm crawling at his feet. I walked out of that office with nothing in my hands, no documents, no proof, nothing to betray the truth. But I carried something far heavier, the knowledge that my silence now had teeth. The transfer was done, the trap was set, and Derek, drunk on his own pride, was already standing on the edge of the cliff. It began with a single email. Hale sent the video file to a handful of recipients' family, former colleagues, and a few carefully chosen names at the golf club, where Derek loved to parade himself. The subject line was simple: "See for yourself." No explanation, no commentary. The truth needed none. Within hours, the clip spread like wildfire. Derek standing tall under chandeliers, his fingers stabbing the air as he spat at me. "You're nothing but a shadow, clinging to my name." The arrogance in his tone, the cruelty in his eyes, it was undeniable. I imagined the silence in living rooms and offices as the video played, old friends shaking their heads, business partners narrowing their eyes, family members whispering to one another in disbelief. Respect erodes quickly when arrogance is exposed. By evening, my phone buzzed with calls I didn't answer. Some were from allies offering quiet support. Others were from people who had once laughed at Derek's jokes, now distancing themselves from the man they had flattered. I let every call go to voicemail. This was Derek's storm to weather, not mine. At the club, I was told, the video played on someone's phone over a round of drinks. Laughter turned to murmurs, murmurs to disgust. The same men who once toasted Derek's name now sneered at the sight of him. High society has no patience for disgrace. It feeds on it, then spits out the carcass. I sat in my apartment that night, the glow of the city washing over my walls, and I allowed myself a single glass of scotch. Not to celebrate, not yet, but to acknowledge the shift. For the first time, Derek was not untouchable. His armor was cracked. His empire had begun to rot from the inside. The leak was only the beginning, and Derek hadn't even realized how deep the wound would go. The boardroom hadn't changed in years, polished mahogany table, leather chairs lined with authority, the skyline stretching beyond the glass windows. Once, I had ruled this room with nothing but my voice and conviction. Now, I entered quietly, taking a seat at the far end, as though I were just another relic of the past. Derek arrived moments later, his smile wide, his stride dripping with arrogance. He greeted the directors like a king among servants, shaking hands, clapping shoulders. He didn't even glance in my direction. To him, I was already invisible. The meeting began with routine chatter, quarterly numbers, projections, polite laughter. Derek leaned back in his chair, playing the role of visionary, confident that everyone in the room was under his spell. Then Hale cleared his throat and slid a stack of papers across the table. Gentlemen, before we continue, I believe there's a matter of ownership we need to address. The room shifted, chairs creaked. Derek frowned, leaning forward. What is this? Hale adjusted his glasses, his tone calm and deliberate. The rightful majority shareholder has called this meeting. All decisions moving forward will require his approval. Confusion rippled through the room. Eyes turned toward me. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of their attention. Derek's expression faltered, the confidence draining from his face, as realization dawned. No, he muttered, shaking his head. This is a mistake. I own this company. I run this board. I opened the folder before me, revealing the certificates, the contracts, the irrefutable proof. My voice was steady, sharper than I expected. Not anymore, Derek. Silence followed, thick and heavy. The board members looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years, respect. And Derek, for the first time, looked small in the very room he thought he owned. The ambush was complete. The king had just realized the throne was never his to begin with. Derek's voice cracked as he tried to recover. This is absurd, he barked, slamming his hand against the table. I am the CEO. I built this company. None of you would be here without me. His words rattled the air, but not the men seated around him. They exchanged glances, their silence louder than any rebuttal. Hale stood calmly, hands clasped behind his back. According to the bylaws, majority ownership dictates final authority. The board has the right to vote on leadership, especially when the company's reputation is at risk. He nodded toward me. The majority shareholder has invoked that right. Derek's eyes blazed as he turned to the directors. You'll back me. You know what I've done for this company. You know I've carried it forward. But his voice carried a tremor, the first sign of weakness in years. One by one, the directors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had seen the video, they had heard the whispers, and they knew the empire Derek flaunted was nothing without the foundation I had laid. Hale raised a hand. All in favor of removing Derek Miller as CEO? Hands lifted, slowly at first, then in unison, like a tide turning against him. Not a single voice rose to defend him. I watched as Derek's face drained of color, his bravado collapsing under the weight of rejection. In that moment, I didn't feel triumph. I felt inevitability. This was always where his arrogance would lead him. Hale's voice was steady. The motion passes. Effective immediately, Derek Miller is removed from his position as Chief Executive Officer. Silence fell again. But this time, it was not heavy with humiliation. It was final, absolute. Derek had been dethroned, and the boardroom, the very stage where he once played king, was now the witness to his fall. The fallout was immediate. By the time Derek stormed out of the boardroom, his phone was already buzzing calls he didn't want to take, messages he didn't want to read. The video had spread wider, faster, and those who once praised him were scrambling to cut their ties before the rot touched them. Investors who once toasted him with champagne sent terse emails demanding explanations. Contracts dissolved overnight, cloaked in polite language about reputation risk. Partners who had stood beside him at galas and golf tournaments stopped returning his calls. The silence of abandonment grew louder with each passing hour. I watched from a distance as his empire, built on arrogance, began to crumble. Deals he bragged about for months vanished in days. Invitations stopped arriving. Even his in-laws, once eager to bask in his glow, distanced themselves when the whispers reached their circles. High society does not tolerate scandal, it feeds on it. They devoured Derek quickly, then spit out the bones. The same men who laughed at his jokes now crossed the street to avoid shaking his hand. The same women who praised his wife's parties now whispered venom about wasted money and gaudy displays. Hale called me with updates, his tone calm, almost detached. They're abandoning him, he said, faster than I expected. I nodded silently, staring out my window at the city skyline Derek once claimed as his kingdom. The towers still stood, but their king had been stripped of his crown. This wasn't victory, it was gravity. And Derek was learning the hardest lesson of all. When you build an empire on borrowed loyalty, the collapse is swift and merciless. The boardroom was nearly empty when Derek returned, his face pale, his tie loosened, his arrogance stripped bare. He slammed the door behind him, the echo bouncing off glass and mahogany. For the first time, I saw not the confident man he pretended to be, but a boy, cornered and desperate. "You planned this," he spat, his voice trembling between rage and fear. "You've been waiting to destroy me." I didn't rise from my chair. I didn't need to. My calmness unsettled him more than anger ever could. "No," I said evenly. "I didn't destroy you. You did that yourself." He paced, pulling at his collar, his eyes darting from me to the papers still spread across the table. "I built this company. You can't take it from me." I let the silence stretch until his words dissolved into the air. Then I spoke, my voice low, steady, final. "This isn't revenge, Derek. This is a receipt." He froze, the weight of the words sinking into him like lead. For a moment, he seemed to shrink, his shoulders collapsing under the truth. The empire he thought was his had never belonged to him. It was borrowed, gifted, squandered, and now it was gone. I gathered the documents, sliding them into my briefcase with deliberate calm. Derek stood motionless, staring at me with eyes that searched for mercy he would not find. I gave him none. Without another word, I walked out of the boardroom, leaving him behind in the silence he had created. For years he had mistaken my patience for weakness. Now he understood it for what it truly was, the calm before justice. The air outside the boardroom was heavy, but I breathed it like freedom. My footsteps echoed down the marble hall, steady and unhurried. Behind me, Derek remained in that room of glass and wood, drowning in the silence he had once forced upon me. For years, I had been the one silenced at dinners, in clubs, in ballrooms, where whispers replaced loyalty. I had endured the weight of absence at funerals, the sting of mockery among strangers, the suffocating quiet of an empty apartment. Silence had been my prison, but now silence belonged to him. I did not look back. I didn't need to. I knew what I would see. A man who once strutted with borrowed pride, now hollow, his voice caught in his throat. No audience left to applaud him. The building's lobby was bustling as I stepped outside, yet I felt none of it. The city carried on, indifferent to the collapse of one man's empire. That was the truth of the world. No matter how loud your arrogance, time, and consequence, speak louder still. I paused on the sidewalk, the afternoon sun cutting through skyscrapers, and let the warmth fall across my face. For the first time in years, the silence was not heavy, it was clean. Derek's silence would stretch on, festering, gnawing at him. Mine, at last, was freedom. The news spread faster than wildfire. By morning, Derek's downfall wasn't just whispered in boardrooms, it was plastered across headlines, echoed in social clubs, dissected in hushed conversations at every dinner table that once welcomed his name. CEO ousted amid scandal. Boardroom coup ends Miller legacy. Is a crest. The stories varied, but the image was always the same. Derek, red-faced and humiliated, the clip of his tirade against me replayed again and again, each broadcast another nail in the coffin of his reputation. At the golf club, they stopped announcing his name on the roster. His membership, once a badge of status, was quietly suspended. Invitations to galas evaporated. Even the so-called friends who had laughed at his cruelty avoided him now, crossing streets, dodging calls, pretending they had never shared his table. His wife tried to salvage appearances, posting photos online with forced smiles and staged vacations. But the comments told the truth. Mockery, disdain, pity. High society does not forgive weakness, and Derek's arrogance had been exposed as nothing more than fragility in disguise. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. I simply watched, detached, as the empire he believed untouchable collapsed beneath him. Justice does not need applause. It only needs time. And Derek's time was over. In the quiet that followed Derek's collapse, I found something I had not felt in years. The weight of my own name restored. For so long I had carried humiliation like a second skin, enduring his insults, his absence, his betrayal. But now, when people spoke my name, it was not with pity, it was with recognition. Respect, long buried beneath his shadow, surfaced once more. Old acquaintances reached out, not with hollow condolences, but with genuine acknowledgement. They remembered who I was, what I had built, and the sacrifices that carried more truth than Derek's boasts ever could. At a luncheon one afternoon, a man raised his glass to me and said, "To Edward Miller, the man who never stopped being the foundation." The room joined him. For a moment, I felt the warmth of dignity seep back into my bones. It wasn't about power anymore. I had no desire to reclaim the empire. no ambition to prove myself in numbers or buildings. What I wanted, what I had finally won, was the restoration of my name. The quiet acknowledgement that I had given everything and that my silence had not been weakness, but restraint. I walked through the city with lighter steps. The skyline, once a cruel reminder of everything I had lost, now stood as proof of what I had built. Those towers were not Derek's park. They had always been mine. And no insult, no betrayal, could erase that truth. Dignity had returned, and with it, a peace I thought I would never know again. I didn't return to the mansion I once owned, nor to the apartment where silence pressed like a weight. Instead, I bought a small house on the edge of the city, where the streets were quiet and the air smelled of cut grass after rain. It wasn't grand, it wasn't gilded, but it was mine. The mornings became my sanctuary. Sunlight spilled through wide windows, painting the walls in soft gold. I placed a rocking chair by the front porch, the same kind my wife had always wanted. Sometimes I would sit there with a cup of coffee, listening to the hum of cicadas, imagining her beside me. In those moments, I felt closer to her than I had in years. Inside, the house carried no ghosts of betrayal. Every room was new, untouched by the memories of arguments or sacrifices. I filled the shelves with books I had long promised myself to read. I hung pictures of my wife not as reminders of loss, but as guardians of peace. Neighbors waved as they passed by, not because of who I had been, but simply because I was there. There was no judgment in their eyes, no whispers of scandal, only the simple kindness of people who lived their lives quietly. It wasn't the life I once envisioned, with empires and legacies stretching into the future, but it was a life of calm, of mornings without humiliation, of nights without loneliness pressing in on me. For the first time in decades, I was living not for Derek, not for appearances, not for anyone's expectations. I was living for myself, and that small house, humble and unremarkable to anyone else, became my palace of peace. The calls began slowly at first, a number I recognized but didn't answer. Then came the texts, short, frantic, sometimes pleading. "Dad, please, let's talk. I made mistakes. Don't shut me out." I read them, every one of them, but my fingers never reached for the phone. For years, I had spoken into silence, calls unreturned, words unacknowledged, my love discarded like scraps. Now it was his turn to know that silence. He showed up once, outside the small house I had bought. I saw his car parked across the street, sleek and desperate against the curb. He didn't knock. He just sat there, waiting, hoping I would come out. I stayed inside, the curtain drawn, my coffee warm in my hands. He waited for an hour before driving away. There was a time I would have rushed to him, no matter the hurt, a time when any flicker of remorse would have been enough to melt my anger. But that time had passed. His absence at his mother's funeral, his laughter at my humiliation, his arrogance in every word, those things could not be undone with apologies typed through guilty fingers. Forgiveness is not owed, it is earned, and Derek had never earned it. I don't hate him. Hatred is still a form of attachment. No, what I feel now is colder, simpler. Nothing. He is no longer a wound, no longer a weight. He is only a reminder of what I survived. So when the phone buzzes, I let it. When the messages arrive, I delete them. When his shadow crosses my street, I stay behind the curtain. He will learn, as I did, that silence can cut deeper than any blade. And in my silence, I am free. Not everyone vanished when my name faded from the headlines. A few men, old allies, comrades from the days when I was still clawing my way up, remained. They didn't come with pity, nor with opportunism. They came with respect. One evening, I opened my front door to find Samuel Gray standing there, holding a bottle of bourbon we once swore to share when life finally slowed down. "Figured it was time," he said with a smile. We sat on the porch until the stars came out, sipping quietly, talking not of Derek or betrayal, but of memories, the deals we nearly lost, the nights we celebrated victories that seemed impossible. Others came too. Richard Hale stopped by often, not just as my lawyer, but as my friend. Together, we shared long dinners, conversations filled with laughter and pauses heavy with the kind of understanding only old men carry. At times, my home filled with voices again. Glasses clinked, chairs scraped against wood floors, and for a few hours, the emptiness lifted. These were not grand parties, not galas with chandeliers and string quartets. They were simple gatherings, honest, warm, free of performance. It struck me then that friendship, Real friendship survives storms. It is not bought with wealth, nor maintained with power. It endures because respect endures. And as I sat surrounded by those who still remembered me not as a shadow but as a man, I realized something profound. I had lost a son, but I had not lost everything. What remained was enough. More than enough. The city that once bowed to Derek now turned its back. His name no longer appeared on guest lists. His chair at the golf club sat empty. His invitations vanished into silence. Even the friends who once flocked to his parties crossed the street to avoid him, as if disgrace were contagious. I heard whispers of him living in the mansion he once flaunted, its halls growing quieter each day. His wife still posted photos, but the smiles were strained, the comments laced with pity and mockery. They were no longer envied, they were pitied. And pity is the cruelest exile of all. I didn't seek these updates. They found me. A passing remark from a neighbor, a snippet from the evening news, an article shared by an old colleague. Each fragment painted the same picture. Derek had become a ghost in the very society he once ruled. He tried to call less often, and eventually, not at all. The silence stretched between us, not heavy, not painful, just final. For years, I had been the one ignored, dismissed, erased. Now it was his turn to feel absence pressing in from every side. The world had moved on without him, and so had I. One morning, I rose before the sun, the air cool and crisp with the scent of dew. I walked the familiar streets of the neighborhood, my steps steady, unhurried. No chauffeur, no entourage, no business to rush toward. Just me, my breath, and the rhythm of my shoes on the pavement. The city skyline loomed in the distance, the towers I had built glowing in the pale light. For years they had mocked me, reminders of what I had given away. But now, they felt different, not symbols of loss, but of legacy. They stood because of me, and nothing Derek had done, or failed to do, could change that. People I passed greeted me with simple nods, warm smiles. They didn't see a fallen titan or a disgraced father. They saw a man walking his morning path, at peace with himself. And that was enough. Each step felt lighter than the last. The weight I had carried, humiliation, grief, betrayal, had slipped from my shoulders. In its place was something quieter, something stronger. Freedom. I paused at a bench overlooking the park and sat down, watching children race across the grass, their laughter echoing through the air. For a long time, I just listened. This was life, not the wealth, not the titles, not the empty applause of people who vanish when the lights go out. Life was in the small things, the honest moments. And as I rose to continue my walk, I realized I wasn't carrying the past anymore. I was simply moving forward. Free. The camera light blinked red, its unblinking eye fixed on me. I sat in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of everything settle, the sacrifices, the betrayals, the justice finally served. My hands rested calmly on the table, no tremor, no hesitation. I looked straight ahead, my voice steady, colder than it had ever been. This isn't revenge. This is a receipt. No anger laced the words. No triumph either, just truth undeniable, unshakable. I rose from the chair, turning my back to the lens, and walked away. No glance over the shoulder, no pause for effect. The floor creaked beneath my steps, the sound fading into the distance until only silence remained. I opened the door and stepped outside, the air fresh against my face. The past no longer clung to me. The weight was gone, and I never looked back.